Good evening. On behalf of the Center for Christian Jewish Learning and our co-sponsor, the Institute for Medieval Philosophy and Theology, I would like to welcome all of you here this evening for a lecture by Professor Daniel Lasker of the Ben-Gurion University of the Negev in Israel. Professor Lasker is no stranger to Boston. He spent many long years at Brandeis for his bachelor's degree, his master's degree, and in his PhD with somebody who was the teacher of some of us here in the room, Alexander Altman, one of the great scholars of Jewish thought and Jewish mysticism of a previous generation. Since leaving Brandeis, Professor Lasker has taught at many different places. He lists 10 different universities where he's taught at one place or another, but he has spent his career at Ben-Gurion University in the Negev, a place which is growing in importance in Jewish studies, an increasingly exciting place on the Israeli university scene. He's the author of 4 books and over 100 different kinds of publications, articles, mostly in the fields of Jewish philosophy, what would translate into Jewish theology here on this campus for the most part. And in this, he has focused on the Jewish-Christian debate. The various aspects of Jewish polemics against Christianity is where he first came to my attention. He's also doing a lot of work on Karaism, which is a group which splits off from Judaism, at least partially, in the medieval period, claiming that rabbinic Judaism is false and errant. So there's another question of 2 groups that have connection but are struggling to define the boundaries in between them. He's also worked on the Jewish calendar and on Judaism and modern medicine, so he is a man of many different talents. It's a real pleasure and a real privilege to be able to welcome Professor Lasker to Boston College, and we look forward to hearing him speak. A topic of the lecture, in case you didn't write it down, is Competing Claims for Truth, Medieval Judaism and Christianity in Conflict.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here at Boston College, and even though I did spend some time here in Boston and university time, and since then, I don't believe I ever came on the campus of Boston College, even though I obviously passed it many times on Commonwealth Avenue and Beacon Street. I wanted to thank Professor Phil Cunningham and Professor Ruth Langer for inviting me, and especially Professor Langer who took the initiative, and whoever else is involved in the co-sponsorship. So thank you very much. I looked, in a sense, just as Ruth looked at my website to see what I was doing. I looked at your website to see what you're doing, and I see that the purpose of the Center for Jewish Christian Learning the center is dedicated to the growth of new and mutually enriching relationships between Jews and Christians and Jews. I hope my talk tonight will not set back this goal too seriously. Because I'm planning to talk about one aspect of the relation, the medieval relation, which is the polemical aspect. Now, that doesn't mean that there weren't mutually enriching relations between Jews and Christians in the past. Last night I talked at Yeshiva University about Jews and Christians in conflict in Provence, and one of the interesting things about the conflict there is the close relationship that the Jewish intellectuals had with the Christian intellectuals, so that when Judah ibn Tibbon, the founder of the Tibbonide family of translators, who were cultural transfers of Spanish Andalusian Jewish culture to the south of France, when he writes in his ethical will to his son about how at his son Samuel's wedding they were so honored that they had the priests and the bishops and the deacons were all had come to that wedding. And there are other relationships of translation and science and astronomy. So there were those relationships, but in the discussion tonight, I wanted to focus on the polemical literature between the 2 religions, and specifically on the methodologies employed by the polemicists to substantiate their arguments. So what I'm trying to do is basically enter into an epistemological question. how does one determine the truth? Now, in my classes, when I start discussing epistemology, I try to explain to them what that means. First of all, in Hebrew, the term is epistemologia. And I explain to them how, of my 5 children, 3 of them were budding epistemologists at age 3. And what does that mean exactly? Every time I would say something to them, they would say, "How do you know?" And so I decided they were epistemologists. Now, it's one of the reasons that this literature flourished without either side scoring a decisive victory, or I guess would be called a smoking gun today in America, is the fact that neither side was able to develop a convincing epistemology or methodology of argumentation, which is what I'm going to argue tonight. But before discussing this argumentation, we have to look a little bit at the history. The Jewish-Christian debate is as old as Christianity, and immediately after the crucifixion, the Christians, who were themselves Jews, began spreading the good news of the Messianic redemption among other Jews. Soon Christianity expanded to include both Gentiles and Jews, and as a result, both of the Christian failure, the Jewish Christian failure to convince other Jews, and also the growing recognition that Jesus' ministry was intended for all humanity. And of course, it was Paul who was central to this development, and it was also Paul who wrote many critical comments about Judaism. Whereas it's unclear whether these comments were meant to be directed at Jews, at Jewish Christians, or Judaizing Gentile Christians, still Paul's words contributed to the ongoing Jewish-Christian debate of future centuries and to developing negative Christian view of Jews and Judaism. Now, after Paul, there are other Christian missionaries who were active among both Jews and the pagans, and Christians composed quite a number of polemical treatises to try to convince themselves and the others of the truth of the new religion. This is a genre of anti-Jewish writings which is basically known as adversus Judaeos, against the Jews, and became a popular literary form among Christian writers. Now, these anti-Jewish tracts are probably intended more for budding missionaries than for the Jewish readers themselves. Undoubtedly, their contents were expressed to Jews by Christian interlocutors. Now, Jews of the first few Christian centuries might not have known all the details of Christian theology, and judging from all the Christian groups which later were declared heretical, apparently not even all Christians knew the details of Christian theology. But the Jews were aware that they were the objects of Christian missionizing activity. Now, these early Christians did not succeed very well in convincing Jews of the truth of Christianity and converting them to Christianity. And in the early centuries, Jews tended not to respond to these threats. At least we don't have any literary remains of Jewish responses. Already we see in the New Testament the Jews are portrayed as ridiculing Jesus' messianic claims. If he could not save himself, how could he save others? We know other early Jewish anti-Christian arguments from the Christian material, from the Christian apologists such as Justin Martyr and for church fathers. And these Christians repeated Jewish arguments against Christianity in order to refute them. So we know that Jews were arguing against Christianity, but we have very little evidence of this from Jewish texts. We have some of the Jewish texts from the Talmud, the Jerusalem Talmud from around the year 400, the Babylonian Talmud, year 500, 600. But these works generally ignored Christianity, even though they they allude to points of conflict between the two religions. There's also some time in the early period, and we don't know exactly when, a Jewish parody of the New Testament called Toldot Yeshu, the story of Jesus, was composed not as a polemical work as such with argumentation, but rather a parody or criticism of Jesus by parodying the New Testament accounts. So in the first 1,000 years or so, or 800 years or so, of the relationship between Jews and Christians, we have Christian literature, but very little Jewish literature. That changes in the 9th century or so, and more Jews turned toward a polemic with Christians, as Christians were intensifying their polemic against Jews. The first of these compositions were written in Islamic countries and in Arabic. It's very interesting. It shows that there doesn't have to be a missionizing threat by Christians in order for Jews to respond to Christian or attack Christian doctrines. When the center of Jewish life turned from Islamic countries to Western Christian countries, European Christian countries, the debate intensified. A great watershed in this respect is the 13th century, when Christians put a much greater emphasis on the mission to the Jews. Their schools of missionaries were set up. Many Christians poured through rabbinic literature, Jewish rabbinic and midrashic literature, to find possible proofs of Christianity. We see this public debates are initiated in Paris in 1240. There's a debate over the Talmud. The Talmud was basically put on trial in 1263 in Barcelona, where Nachmanides, the foremost Jewish authority of his age, was forced to come and debate against Pablo Cristiani. New polemical strategies are developed by Christians, and eventually Christians gave the Jews the choice of death, conversion, or expulsion. And part of this historical process was a proliferation of treatises, which we could call specifically polemical treatises. Now, these treatises represent an asymmetrical relationship between the two religions. After all, Christians were trying to convert Jews or convince Jews of the truth of Christianity, whereas Jews were basically defending their right to remain as Jews and to convince other Jews not to convert. So even though, as I said, there are such polemics in the absence of a missionary threat, by and large, the Jewish literary critique of Christianity is a product of the need to defend Judaism and Jews against Christian attacks. Although the heyday was the Middle Ages, and with the expulsion of the Jews from Western Europe, so that by the year 1500 there are almost no Jews left in Western Europe, the debate continued in Italy and Eastern Europe, and the debate continues to this day, with each side producing literature. But again, today, neither religion is monolithic, and one cannot necessarily say that literature represents the whole story, the relationship between Jews and Christians to this day. But if one looks at the modern literature, it's interesting, there are significant parallels between the medieval literature and the modern literature. Now, this literature, which I study, is a very problematic genre. I know some other people here also are familiar with this type of literature. We don't know necessarily why people were writing. Were they writing to their own community? Were they writing to the other community? Most Christian writers wrote in Latin, which most Jews could not read. Most Jewish writers wrote in Hebrew, which most Christian readers could not read. We don't know how effective this literature was. People ask, was anybody ever convinced by any of these writings, either to convert or not to convert or whatever? The nature of this polemical literature is somewhat problematic. It's not necessarily intellectually uplifting. Many of the polemicists involved in vulgarity, accusations which had no basis in fact. Anybody who knows anything about the polemical genre, and I'm not talking necessarily religious polemics. One could think about political polemics. One can think about debates between candidates before an election, where each accuses the other of all kinds of nefarious deeds. Of course, afterwards, then they shake hands and they're all friends. But this is what polemics is about, trying to use any argument in one's arsenal to convince the other side or convince one's own side. I think also, to a certain extent, this literature served not only for enlightenment, so that people would know the different arguments of each side, but also as entertainment. After all, people didn't have television and video and internet and whatever. And if there was a public lecture, probably fill bigger halls because there's nothing else, not much competition at the time. Another aspect of literature is that what I call it's all's fair in love, war, and polemics. That many times what an author writes in his work does not represent his true belief. We have authors who in a philosophical work say one thing, in a polemical work say something different. Authors make up public debates that never occurred in order to give a literary framework for their works. So that, as I said, the literature itself is problematic, but does not mean it's not important. It leads to an understanding of many aspects of intellectual history. It gives us an insight into popular religion, what the arguments that were bandied about by the different sides. It gives us an idea of interreligious understanding and misunderstanding. It's an aid to understanding certain historical trends. And along with everything else, for some of us, it's a living. Now, given that short, cursory, and inadequate introduction, what I wanted to do was actually look at the argumentation. What are they saying? What are the arguments? What are the methodologies for using the argumentation? First of all, I would say there are three types of arguments being used. The first type is exegetical, namely how to interpret a holy text. The second might be called historical or social, and a third might be called rational. Let's start with the exegetical. The holy texts which were looked at were the Hebrew Bible, which the Christians consider the Old Testament, the New Testament, and rabbinic literature. The purpose is basically to show that the holy text substantiates my position and undermine your position. Christians would use the Hebrew Bible and rabbinic literature, the post-biblical Hebrew Jewish literature, as a proof of Christianity, so that if the book of Isaiah talks about the suffering servant, Christians identified that with Jesus. If the Midrash implies that the Messiah had already come, then Christians would use that to say to the Jews they have no longer any messianic hopes. Jews, on the other hand, would argue from the New Testament. They'd say the New Testament rejects the claims of contemporary Christianity. After all, Jesus observed the law. Jesus said he came not to abolish the law. Contemporary Christians did not. Christians generally didn't argue against Jews for the truth of Christianity from the New Testament because Jews didn't accept the New Testament. But they did argue from the Hebrew Bible and from rabbinic literature. Historical social arguments are based on the vicissitudes of history and the attempt to justify one religion over the other on the basis of history, let's say military victories, or questions as to which religious society is a better society. And if one of them is better than the other, then perhaps its religion is a truer religion. And rational arguments I would divide into what I call common sense arguments, such as God wouldn't require the murder of his son in order to bring redemption, or philosophical in terms of the fact that perhaps a triune God who is both three in one, in which one aspect of God has a causative relation with other aspects, is logically absurd. So we have those, both of them claim to be based on reason, but one is more like God wouldn't do such a thing, whereas the other one is more strictly on the philosophical basis of what is consistent or contradictory or self-contradictory. And in each type of argument, there's a question of veracity. There's an epistemological question of truth. And what I'm saying this evening is that it seems to me that neither side was effective in developing a convincing objective methodology of their argumentation. Let me give examples, first to do from exegesis and history, and then I'll concentrate on the philosophy, which is more of interest to me. Let's look at exegesis. Around the year 1170, Joseph Kimchi, who composed one of the first Jewish anti-Christian polemical works in Hebrew in Christian Europe, quoted a Christian as saying, "You," namely the Jews, "understand most of the Torah literally, while we understand it figuratively. Your whole reading of the Bible is erroneous, for you resemble him who gnaws at the bone, while we suck at the marrow within. You are like the beast that eats the chaff, while we eat the wheat. And what did the Christian mean? He said, look, the Bible has laws. It says you should circumcise yourselves, but that doesn't mean literally circumcision. Those of you who take it literally are missing the point. Circumcision means purification. The Paschal lamb had nothing to do with taking a lamb and slaughtering it. It had to do with a prefiguration of Jesus. Sabbath prohibitions are not necessarily meant to be Sabbath prohibitions. Purity laws. When the Bible, the Torah, Pentateuch talks about eternal laws, eternal doesn't necessarily mean to be always. The Christians understand the Bible correctly, the Hebrew Bible correctly, by understanding its allegorical nature, its figurative nature. Jews are too literal. Well, that may be true in certain respect, but Christians were certainly capable of interpreting verses that they wanted to interpret them very literally. I mentioned the suffering servants of the Lord before. His grave is among the wicked. He suffered for our sins. The Christians say, oh, that's allegorical? No, they say it's literal. That actually happened. Psalm says that we're conceived in iniquity. Well, Christians take that as very literal, meaning original sin. So there are many Hebrew Bible passages which are taken extremely literally by Christians. And Jews, on the other hand, take another number of passages as being allegorical. When the wolf lies down with the lamb, among most of the Jewish rationalists at least, said that doesn't mean that there'll be a change of nature. When the Messiah comes, the only way the wolf and the lamb will live together if there's a new lamb every day. The law is to be taken literally, as incorporated in the oral law, which doesn't always have a literal interpretation of the biblical law. But certainly historical accounts, descriptions of God, sometimes can be literally, some can be allegorical. This was the subject of the Maimonidean controversies in the 13th and 14th centuries. But Christianity has the same problem. Christian rationalists also have to accept certain passages as allegorical and certain as literal. But what about the New Testament? Jews said to the Christians, you interpret the New Testament much too literally. When Jesus at the Last Supper said, this is my body, this is my blood, what did Christians, at the time Catholics, even though it was always an issue even in Catholicism, what did they say? That Jesus literally meant the bread became my body, the wine became my blood. What did Jews say? No, this is meant allegorically. He didn't mean literally to be the fact. When Jesus said, I have not come to abolish the law, do Christians take that literally? No, they take it allegorically. And on the other hand, when the Midrash, when it says in the Midrash that, for instance, that the Messiah was born on the day that the temple was destroyed, Christians say, oh, that meant the Messiah has already come, and therefore there's no more Jewish hope. Whereas Jews say that this has other meanings rather than a literal application. So what I'm saying is that even though there are occasional attempts at methodology, trying to say when one should interpret things literally and when one should interpret them allegorically, there's an attempt at contextualization of verses. The bottom line seems to be in all these debates, and in fact the exegetical debate was the bulk of the debate in the Middle Ages, the bottom line seems to be that first one has one's theological commitments, then one interprets holy texts. And if that's the case, there's certainly no methodology of how to interpret. Let's look at history. In the book of Kuzari by Judah Halevi in the 12th century, he quotes the king of the Khazars, the Khuzars who convert to Judaism, but this is a fictional account, as saying, the king says, how is it, if Judaism is the true religion, how is it Christians and Muslims are strong and the Jews are weak? So what does Judah Halevi answer, or his representative in the debate? He says that when the other religions were weak, They glorified weakness. Therefore, the original Christian martyrs were taken by Christians as proof of the truth of Christianity. Muhammad had to flee from Mecca to Medina. This wasn't seen as an admission of defeat or being wrong. In fact, it's interesting that the king, when he says this, he says that our being weak is indeed a sign of our belief in God. The king says, yes, but when you're strong, you might turn around and do to your enemies exactly what they're doing to you, to which, in fact, the author admits that that's probably true. The problem with historical arguments is that when one is weak, dying for God proves the truth of religion. When one is strong, then killing for God proves the truth of religion. All right, so if both dying and killing are proof, it seems to me that there is no proof. History has not ended yet. So how can one argue from history? And one generation's absolute truths and absolute certainties, whether it's manifest destiny, divine right of kings, white man's burden, or any of these other terms, that were so accepted as God's will in one generation, are seen in another generation as against God's will. Does that stop people from theological judgments? No. In fact, both Jews and Christians agreed that Jewish exile was a result of sin. The difference of opinion was what was the sin for which Jews were in exile. For the Christians, it was the sin of the crucifixion, of deicide. For Jews, it was a sin of not being sufficiently observant and sufficiently believing in God. In fact, Jewish exile as a sign, the medievals took Jewish exile as a sign of punishment for Jews for the crucifixion, has its influence to this day and made it difficult for many Christians to accept a reborn Jewish state, especially a strong, triumphant one. In addition, when Jews and Christians are arguing from history, there is another player on the stage, and that is world Islam. Jews would say, how could Christians claim exclusive truth on the basis of Christian strength when there are Muslims who are just as strong as the Christians, and after Saladin, they retook the Holy Land. And this Christian-Muslim controversy, which is still being played out today, has strong roots in the Middle Ages, and was pointed out by Jews as a sign of the weakness of Christian argumentation from their own strength. What about social arguments? Well, here, Jews claim that Christians are immoral. They engage in murder, theft, sexual sins. Priestly celibacy is a sham. As opposed to Christian sins, Jews are hospitable. They don't let their children use foul language. They're charitable. Jewish society is much better than Christian society from the Jewish point of view. What do Christians claim? Christians claim no, the Jews are immoral. Jews lend an interest. Jews are untrustworthy. But this leads to the question as to how does one judge a society? How does one say that a society as a whole is a better society than another one? And even if one could, what would this tell us about the truth of religion? As it is, we tend to say that people who act as religionists but do something bad aren't really representative of that religion. At least people try to claim that. So that the Sabbath-observant thief is what's said among Jews, that under his beard is actually clean-shaven. Rumor has it the members of the mafia are good attenders at Mass. On the other hand, there are people who do terrible things in the name of their religion, and even, you can take your pick, and even though one tries to say they don't really represent their religion, still it's hard to see that at least they think they are. What I'm trying to say, though, is that the question of the truth of religion should not necessarily be a utilitarian or pragmatic one. Is it only on the basis of which religion produces a better society, assuming we could even determine which religion makes a better society? Or are there truth claims involved about the nature of the doctrines of the religions? All right, so it seems to me that historical social arguments also have a problem of methodology. And let's look at common sense arguments. One argument we see often, I mentioned the Book of the Covenant of Joseph Kimchi, has graphic descriptions of the indignities of gestation and birth, arguments which originate in the Islamic world, Jews argue, and Muslims against Christians there, against incarnation. In fact, explicit descriptions of bodily functions apparently were quite popular. Anyway, Joseph Kimchi says, "Thus I do not profess this belief which you profess, for my reason does not allow me to diminish the greatness of God be exalted, for he has not lessened his glory may be exalted, nor has he reduced his splendor be extolled." We find these arguments in the Christian literature. Odo of Tournai, at the beginning of the 12th century, quotes a Jew, Leo, as arguing against incarnation from that point of view. But for the Christian, the gestation and birth either did not involve indignities at all, because Jesus was not touched by the impurities, the female impurities, just like light can shine through garbage without itself becoming soiled. And even if it did, even if there were such indignities, all it proved was God's great love for humanity. No one apparently seemed to doubt the assumption that the female innards are somehow repellent or repulsive. So no one argued from that point of view, but they just argued that whether or not this is impossible for God to undergo the process of birth, of being born. Or take from the Christian point of view, Anselm of Canterbury, who developed the rational understanding of the need for incarnation of the God-man sacrifice. Now, Anselm seemed to think that this is a result of human reason, that reason demands this to be the case. And in fact, his establishment of Christianity on the basis of reason led one of his followers, Peter Venerabilis, in the middle of the 12th century, to basically deny Jewish humanity. On what basis? If the definition of a human is a rational animal, and anyone rational will accept Christianity, then anybody who doesn't accept Christianity is not rational, and if the person is not rational, then this person can't be a human being. On the other hand, Jews looked at this argument and said, doesn't make sense. Jacob ben Reuben, 12th century, explained it this way. He said, if a king hears that one of his subjects committed a terrible crime, does a king volunteer to take off his royal clothes, demean himself, and then have himself killed to atone for the sin of his subject? So what looked like someone to be reason, ratio in Latin, or common sense to someone else is not. Now, I'd like to turn to the philosophical arguments, which is my major interest, and probably the bulk of the methodological part of the talk. Now, in these polemics, there are true methodological discussions, as one would expect from philosophers. And specifically, the philosophical part of the debate revolves around the questions which theological doctrines are possibly true and which ones are indubitably false. The Jewish polemicists argued that a religion which teaches impossible or self-contradictory doctrines is ipso facto false. To their mind, Christian doctrines are properly considered rationally impossible, and therefore Christianity is a false religion of necessity. So in order to validate this argumentation, it was necessary to establish epistemological categories concerning truth claims, categories in which the distinction between imagination and intellect played a role in this discussion. The polemicists had to determine which of these two categories, imagination or intellect, would determine possibility, and which one provides the wherewithal to support or reject specific religious doctrines. Now, this discussion begins with Maimonides in his Guide of the Perplexed, written in the late 12th century. And it's a polemical context, but not an anti-Christian polemical context. Maimonides is arguing against the Jewish and Muslim followers of the Kalam, who, according to Maimonides, were not sufficiently scientifically rigorous in their theological discussions. Maimonides himself tried to navigate between the naturalistic and scientific theories of Aristotle, which were claimed to be based on the intellect, and claims of theology. According to Maimonides, these theological claims of the kalam were based on imagination. So, in light of this distinction, Maimonides argued that only the intellect determines possibility, not imagination, so that one could imagine, presumably, an elephant the size of a gnat, but that would not make such an elephant possible, since the enormous size of the elephant is part of its essential definition. On the other hand, Maimonides says, it would be difficult to imagine two people standing on either side of a ball without one of them at least falling, if not both, falling off. And yet, on the other hand, we know that that's what happens on the earth, that there are people on either ends of the earth, and neither one falls off. So that although Maimonides knew the intellect and not the imagination was the arbiter of possibility, he himself was incapable of drawing firm boundaries between the possible and the impossible. What he called the kalam theory of admissibility, that anything imaginable is possible, he said, is not a theory which one hastens to reject in its entirety with nonchalance. And Maimonides also said, would that I know how one can make the final adjudication between the two classes of possible and impossible. Now, as I said, Maimonides is arguing here against this Islamic theology called the kalam. But later readers could see that his argumentation was used against Christianity as well. Among the examples that were proffered by Maimonides as impossible beliefs, disavowed by the intellect, are that God should bring into existence someone like himself, or should annihilate himself, or should become a body, or should change. So a philosophical polemicist against Christianity could easily relate these impossibilities with the Christian views of the generation of the Son and procession of the Spirit, the incarnation, the putative death of the Son of God on the cross, and it's possible that even Maimonides himself was thinking in that direction. There are other impossibilities Maimonides mentioned, such as substance becoming accident or accident becoming substance, or a physical substance to exist without accidents. And here it's highly unlikely that Maimonides was actually referring to Christian transubstantiation, which became the Orthodox belief only 11 years after his death in 1215 in the Fourth Lateran Council. And yet later Jewish polemicists also use these examples as impossible beliefs, referring specifically to transubstantiation. In Maimonides' lifetime is the beginning of the polemic in Western Europe against, the literary polemic in Western Europe against Christianity. And his contemporaries, I mentioned both of them, Jacob Ben Reuben and Joseph Kimchi, did try to use rationalistic argumentation, so that Joseph wrote the incarnation is rejected by the intellect because it unseemly for God to suffer the indignities of gestation and birth, as I mentioned, but he didn't offer any philosophical proofs of that assertion. Jacob Ben Reuben referred to Trinity, incarnation, virgin birth, but didn't come up with a theory of possibility. Both of these authors use the term in Hebrew seichel very much, which means ratio, because of the discourse in the 12th century about the rationality of Christianity. These Jewish authors were arguing that indeed Christianity is not rational. It's that Judaism, if anything, is the rational religion, not Christianity. Now, a true theory of possibility develops only toward the end of the 14th century in Spain, probably as a result of Christian successes in converting Jews, often but not always by means of force, such as in the riots of 1391. Also, there's the influence of Averroism, which distinguished between philosophy and religion, such that a philosophical defense of religion was well nigh impossible. Thus, the Jewish philosophers understood that they could not prove the truth of Judaism by use of reason, but they were hopeful of finding a way of rationally refuting Christianity so it would be less attractive to their wavering co-religionists. The result was a principle that although reason cannot prove the truth of religion as per Averroes, it can disqualify a false religion by demonstrating the rational untenability of its doctrines. Right. And building on another passage of Maimonides, what these philosophical polemicists did was to distinguish between what they called natural impossibility, such as dividing a sea or turning a rod into a serpent, and the logical impossibility, such as the existence of a square whose sides and diagonal are the same length, or a triangle the sum of whose angles was more than 2 right angles. I try also against my students when I talk about logical impossibility, I say, for instance, a married bachelor. So they all come up with anecdotes of people who pretended to be bachelors but really married. But that wasn't exactly what it's talking about. It's talking about something which is logically impossible, such as a square whose side and diagonal are the same length. In the context of the debate with Christianity, the Jewish polemicists argued that a true religion may teach naturally impossible doctrines, since God has the power to change nature, but it could not teach logically impossible doctrines, since that which is truly impossible is not subject to divine power. Christian principles such as Trinity, Incarnation, Transubstantiation, Virgin Birth, and Partu were then subjected to philosophical analysis in the hopes of demonstrating that they are logically impossible, contradicted by the intellect as well as being self-contradictory, and therefore could not be taught by a true religion. From the Jewish point of view, Christianity, which promulgated such logically impossible doctrines, is of necessity a false religion. Judaism was claimed taught no such logically impossible self-contradictory doctrines. Those doctrines which Judaism does teach, which appear to be impossible, require merely the abrogation of what is naturally impossible. Judaism is therefore a possibly true religion. And one could go one step further. If there are only 3 candidates for a possibly true divine religion, namely Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and Christianity is eliminated for the beliefs that I mentioned, and Islam has other rational problems, according to some of the Jewish polemicists, that leaves only Judaism. This is the tact taken by Joseph Albo in the 15th century, even though he didn't really develop the anti-Islamic polemic. All right. The theory that there's a difference between the rationally impossible and the logically impossible is really reminiscent of the Kalam's view, as reported by Maimonides, that the possible is determined by imagination, and as such would be open to Maimonides' Aristotelian critique, namely, not anything which is imaginable is possible. So why is resurrection of the dead, which is against nature but imaginable, any more acceptable than an imagined elephant the size of a flea, which Maimonides rejected as impossible? If one holds that the laws of nature reflect logical necessity, as the Aristotelians tended to do, then there cannot be a difference between natural impossibility and logical impossibility. And this is the reason why traditional Jewish beliefs such as creation ex nihilo, resurrection, and the splitting of the Red Sea are problematic for Maimonides, and why many of Maimonides' readers are somewhat skeptical of his holding those views. Once nature exists following necessary laws which reflect divine wisdom, a break in nature would be impossible, even if imaginable. For a true Aristotelian, and thus maybe for Maimonides himself, resurrection of the dead is no more possible than an elephant the size of a flea or incarnation of the second person of the Trinity. Now, it seems to me that the Jewish philosophical polemicists were aware of the problematic of their methodology, this distinction between natural impossibility and logical impossibility, and they didn't want to use the term imagination, which Maimonides has said could not be used, and therefore they talked about representation, siur in Hebrew. Could a belief be represented or not? Now, this idea of intellectual conception also goes back to Maimonides in his discussion of divine attributes, where he says that belief is not the notion which is uttered, but the notion that is represented in the soul when it has been averred to it that it is in fact just as it has been represented. So that in order to have faith, one has to be able to represent that faith, have a representation, intellectual representation of that faith. And Maimonides in that context even says that the statement of the mistaken believers that God is one but has attributes is like the doctrine of the Christians who say that God is one but also three and the three are one. So from Maimonides' point of view, neither view, namely attributes or Trinity, can be represented in the mind, and therefore neither one can be true. A true belief is one which is intellectually conceivable. False beliefs like the Trinity are those which are not intellectually conceivable. Thus, the later polemicists made intellectual conceivability a representation, not imagination, as a determining principle for possibility and impossibility. So they said if it can be represented intellectually, yes, possible. If not, no. So we see that Jews distinguished between Jewish beliefs, which they said were possible, and Christian beliefs, which were not. How did the Christians respond? Well, first of all, it's obvious that many of the Christians knew these problems even without Jewish prompting. Many of the Christian beliefs, especially the mysteries, were understood to be problematic vis-a-vis the intellect. Medieval Christian philosophers developed a vast apologetical literature answering internal Christian doubts about the rationality of their beliefs, literature which is most likely not related to the Jewish critique, except perhaps as a source for some of the arguments, the Jewish argumentation. Take, for instance, Thomas Aquinas. The mid-13th century is struggling with these very problems which 100 and 150 years later, Jews are accusing Christians of being believing in rationally impossible beliefs. The standard Christian philosophical claim, as developed by the apologists, was that Christian doctrines, even if they appear to be rationally questionable, can be defended by reason and therefore not to be dismissed out of hand. Christian philosophers, very much like the Jewish ones, argue that the seemingly impossible doctrines are not logically impossible. And therefore, just an example, question of the union of God and man in the person of Jesus. And when none of the models of union known from the Aristotelian literature was sufficient to explain such a union, Thomas theorized the existence of something called a hypostatic union. Hypostatic union would be one in which one hypostasis of God can be united with a human being. So that there is a necessity from the Christian point of view of proving the possibility of the truth of Christian doctrines. But there's also another response, which we see in the Jewish polemical literature, where the Christians were aware of the Jewish attack on the rationality of their beliefs. If we can rely on these sources, some Christian interlocutors reacted to the Jewish assault on their religion by arguing that Christian doctrines were no more impossible than the Jewish ones, and therefore Judaism was no more intellectually respectable than Christianity. I can give a number of examples. Nissim of Marseille from the 14th century quotes a Christian as saying that, why is it that you believe in resurrection and creation and you deny incarnation? In fact, creation of the world ex nihilo makes less sense than incarnation, because incarnation is creation from something, creation of the world from nothing. There's no basis, that's impossible. And Nissim responds that the Christian beliefs are those that undermine religion, since the minute that one believes in an incarnated God, God is no longer a necessary existence. Resurrection of the dead and creation do not undermine religion. In fact, they are politically useful beliefs for the masses. So the distinction for Nissim, the distinction between prima facie impossible Jewish beliefs and actually impossible Christian beliefs, is the distinction between the theological and politically useful and the philosophically abhorrent from his point of view. Similar question is found in a contemporary of Nissim, 14th century Provençal, Joseph ibn Cosby. Again, the Christians said, how can you believe in creation and resurrection and reject incarnation. So Cosby argued that the Jewish beliefs do not imply any deficiency in God, whereas incarnation does imply such inadequacy. Whether attributing inadequacy to God is a philosophical problem, as would appear in Nissim's work, or a theological problem is not clear, because Cosby says, God forbid, Chalila, that there be a divine substance in the divine substance potentiality for evil or deficiency. And we have other authors who raised a similar question. How is it, according to the Christians, the Jews are willing to believe in impossible beliefs and not in, or let's put it this way, some impossible beliefs and not other impossible beliefs, such as the incarnation? What is common to these discussions of possibility is that the Jewish philosophical polemicists struggled to find a way of distinguishing between problematic Jewish beliefs and problematic Christian ones. As good Maimonideans, the polemicists asserted the intellect is the proper determinant of possibility and could distinguish between natural impossibility and logical impossibility. But also as good Maimonideans, they probably would have had to admit that they were not totally successful in distinguishing between the possible and the impossible. And with Maimonides, they could say, would that they knew how to determine the difference between the two classes. So even in the realm of the strictly philosophical argumentation, an ironclad epistemological rule of distinguishing between impossible beliefs and possibly true beliefs escaped the polemicists. We see from this discussion the two sides talked past each other for more than one reason. Not only do they start with different theological groundings, but they have also no agreed-upon methodology of pursuing their debate. It's not like a baseball game in which the ground rules are laid out in advance. It's not like a legal system in which there are clear ways of determining correct procedure. It's not like geometry with its axioms and theorems. But perhaps that is what one might expect from theological questions which are not amenable to proof in the same manner as the sciences. This, however, did not stop the polemicists from defending their own religion and attacking that of their opponents, and does not stop those of us who study the polemical literature from attempting to understand its contribution to the Jewish-Christian encounter. Thank you very much. And I'll be happy if, well.
Yeah, Mr. Lasker would be happy to take questions, or just ask for the sake of the videotaping that use the microphone.
Thank you. Since one of the primary goals of polemic is to convert, but the exegetical, historical, social, and rational arguments didn't seem to be very successful in converting Jews, and since few Christians converted to Judaism, and the Jews weren't probably very enthusiastic about their converting in the first place.
It was actually dangerous.
Right. And we see that secular and canon laws are replete with prohibitions of Jewish proselytism. Why? Why prohibit something that's not working in any case?
Okay, so first of all, you start out with the assumption that the polemical literature is to convert the other side, whereas it often can be to convince one's own side. Why should Jewish proselytization attempts be forbidden if they weren't doing it? Then they probably were doing it to a certain extent. Why should they be prohibited if it was not effective? Well, first of all, I'm assuming that's not effective, certainly with a Christian audience. But that didn't mean that the Christians didn't find it offensive that Jews were not only holding on to their own religion, but actively criticizing the majority religion. And in fact, in the public debates, as you well know, there was no opportunity for Jews to attack Christianity. In fact, that was when ground rules were laid out. It was, we're trying to find out why you don't accept the truth. You have no right to tell us that what we believe in is not the truth. All you can do is tell us why you don't accept the truth. So the Jews it's unlikely that Jews were actually trying to convert the Christians. They were just trying to maintain Jewish identity and prevent Jews from converting to Christianity. As to how effective this literature was in that respect, I don't know. And even if we assume it wasn't effective, and even if we assume that the authors themselves were maybe uncomfortable with their own line of argumentation, I don't think that's any reason that would stop people. Again, using the imagery from elections, we just had elections in Israel. One party knew that it had no chance of winning. That didn't stop them from electioneering until the very last minute and claiming they're going to have victory and giving all the arguments why everybody should vote for them. So people are under attack or feeling under attack, will want to do something about it.
I'm taking things from a different approach in the sense that I think many of the debates are internal debates of the particular groups themselves. For example, you have in the early Christian church a big battle with Marcionism, where Marcion is going to be very much against any attachment to what the Christians would call the Old Testament. So the Christians themselves, to be self-consistent with what they're arguing, that really there isn't like God had one thing and then he abandoned it and then he started another. There's just a continuity to God's plan. They have to argue in a certain way that is going to go against Marcion. And it's not a Jewish debate, it's an internal Christian debate. I wonder if there's not also the same kind of thing as you get to someone like Maimonides. Maimonides, did everybody really interpret and accept him in the same way? If I look at, for example, the Guide, Book 1, Chapter 34, it seems to me, if I were taking a Straussian viewpoint or a Pines viewpoint and interpretation, that he really is very much a rationalist, and that you have to have the scriptures because most people never get to the level of being Aristotelian philosophers. So you need the scriptures to sort of lead them along. I'm in some way, I guess I'm trying to examine whether the debate between Christians and Jews is at a certain level, but when you get to the level of the theologians and philosophers, it's sort of an internal kind of debate. And I would continue that into the 14th century because you'll get Durandus of Saint-Pourçain will argue against us being able to really show that it's reasonable to accept the Trinity or the Incarnation. It's not a Jewish-Christian debate, it's a debate within the university itself, maybe for the purpose of trying to, not to oppose, but to come to a deeper understanding of to what degree can you really justify this as reasonable that you believe such a thing. So I'm pushing it a different way instead of Jewish-Christian, whether there's a debate within the Christians and a debate within the Jewish traditions that are also asking the same kinds of questions.
Oh, so first of all, certainly that's correct. I mean, that there are internal Jewish and Christian problems, and when Christians turn to the Talmudic literature and criticize it, there have already been both Muslim and internal Jewish criticisms of the Talmud and the Midrash. As I try to point out, it's one of the problems with this literature is that we don't always know, I'd say, the zitz and leben of it's being written. We don't know the audience. We can assume that the audience, when it's written in Hebrew by a Jew, the audience is a Jewish audience. And when it's written by Latin by a Christian, the audience is a Christian. And what do we do with Abner Burgos, who wrote some of his polemics in Hebrew? Presumably he wrote it because he really wanted Jews to be able to read the work, or perhaps because that was the language which he was most familiar, having been a Jew most of his life. When Chastai Kreskes, whose work I've edited, wrote it in the vernacular, a number of people assume that he wrote it for a Christian audience because he wrote it in the vernacular, but that doesn't seem to make any sense at all. Why would Christians want Kreskes to explain to them what's wrong with their religion? He is writing it for people who are apparently so highly assimilated that it's easier for them to read a vernacular text than to read a Hebrew text. So there are a lot of things going on in the polemical literature. I think you're absolutely correct. And one of the things that we try to do when reading is to figure out what's going on. However, when we see, for instance, the use of arguments which the author himself disagreed with, such as Crescus in his philosophical work writes one thing, in his polemical work writes something else, then presumably it's really for a polemical purpose. It's not for internal philosophical exposition. But the polemical purpose can be an internal polemical need, not necessarily a external polemical need. And the same thing with Maimonides. Maimonides is not necessarily polemicizing against Christianity, which is not a major issue for him, even though in Egypt there are many Copts, and the Fostat where he lived is the center both of Jews and of the Copts in Cairo. And he's not really arguing against Muslims as such. He's arguing against literalists, fundamentalists, non-rationalists of all religion, one could say. It's a very universalistic view, and what you say about the use of the Holy Scripture for the masses was certainly the view taken by the philosophers of all the groups, of all the religions.
A second question. Yitzhak Ber, in his History of the Jews of Christian Spain, indicated that he believed that philosophy was one of the causes of widespread conversion. What's your view of this?
Okay, my view is that he is being unfair to the philosophers, and what he did was he took a medieval argument against rationalism, and he just extended it and said the medievals who said that rationalists were no good were correct. What I think is indicative is the fact that the very same rationalists who are promoting this view of Judaism, of non-literal understanding the text, and a non-fundamentalist view of theology, are also the same ones who are polemicizing against Christianity. They're the ones who are developing a rational criteria for refuting Christianity. So certainly the philosophers that we're talking about are devoted to both rationalism but to Jewish continuity, we'd say today. Now, that doesn't mean that there were not people who went to the universities and learned, maybe not the universities, but learned philosophy and became skeptical of the truth claims of any religion, which is what Averroes is all about, and who say, look, if a particular faith commitment will not make any difference to my ultimate felicity in terms of the life after death, and if in this world it's a lot easier to be a Christian than to be a Jew, therefore I should be a Christian, I can't say there weren't people who took that viewpoint, but to make a blanket accusation of philosophy and try to say because the Ashkenazic German Jewry were not philosophers, therefore they favored or they chose martyrdom over conversion, and the Spanish Jews were philosophers and therefore they chose conversion over death, doesn't seem to me to be provable proposition. I don't think it's true. I think one has to look also in general at the society, how Jews in Spain looked at their Christian neighbors as opposed to how Jews in Germany looked at their Christian neighbors. One has to remember in the 18th and 19th century, conversion to Christianity in Germany becomes widespread, not because necessarily they were attracted to the Christian religion, but they were attracted to Christian society. And I think that has a lot to do with it also, and not necessarily philosophical issues as such.
I have a question which is coming out of some of the work that I've been doing on primarily 16th century censorship of Jewish texts. which is to say that when I look at the liturgical text and I see that every word that could possibly be conceived of as anti-Christian has been crossed out in all existing texts practically that are in the 16th century, and digging around in hundreds of texts, you could maybe find one that was missed. How do you have this literature at all? Because a Jewish polemical literature, which is saying the kinds of things that are being said about Christianity in the kinds of texts that you've been able to publish, is astounding that it survived at all. What's happened?
Okay. Well, first of all, I think people had a commitment to producing and then preserving this literature, even though certain of the texts are preserved in very few manuscripts, which would indicate that it was dangerous to keep these texts, and people knew it. Prayer, as you know, is a public event. Anybody can walk into a synagogue, and if they know the key words and see what's going on, it could be dangerous for Jews. As the great example is from the Aleinu L'Shabeach prayer, where in 1400 or so, an apostate from Judaism to Christianity named Pesach, originally took the name Peter, said that Jews say this thing, that the Jews say that the other nations worship a God who cannot save, and there's a problem with the numerical value of the word vanity and the name Jesus, and this is one of the major censorships from the prayer book. But as I said, this would seem to me was a public prayer, is a public event, and therefore it was more dangerous for the public. Those who were engaged in the polemics could keep them perhaps more privately, and even there certainly were Jews who knew this literature, who then, when converted, were able to outline what was going on. In the 17th century, we have Wagenseil, the student of Judaism and the polemicist, who published these texts, actually, as the fiery darts of Satan, but he published them to show Christians what terrible things Jews were saying about Christianity. I think Jews had an idea that this was a very necessary enterprise. And again, were they wrong that it was a necessary enterprise? I don't know. But they did it. And the literature is preserved to a great extent. And they took their chances in a sense that they wouldn't get into too big trouble, especially if they wrote in Hebrew, which wouldn't be easily understood by the Christians.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Let me formally thank Professor Lasker for a discussion which I hope will be the first of many that the Center for Christian Jewish Learning can sponsor here at Boston College, helping us gain insight and a depth of knowledge about our history, but also about where we are going. Let me give a brief plug for a series of somewhat more popular fora that will be held over the next couple months. The first one next Thursday night. The title of the series is Christians and Jews: Shared History, Sharing the Future. And next Thursday night, next door in Higgins 300, the topic is going to be speaking to each other in times of controversy. So it's a direct segue of tonight's topic, but a little bit more contemporary. And the speakers will be Dr. Roseanne Catalano for the Institute of Christian and Jewish Studies in Baltimore, the Reverend Samuel Lloyd of Trinity Church of Boston, and Barry Schrage, the president of Combined Jewish Philanthropies here in Boston also. So I look forward to seeing all of you, and you're bringing your friends with you also next Thursday night. Thank you.